without further ado, I'd like to introduce our three speakers. We have Dr. Greg Moore, formerly the Principal of Burnley College of the Institute of Land Flood Resources at Melbourne University from 1988 to 2007 and Head of the School of Resource Management at the University from 2002 to 2007. He's a well-known speaker at conferences and on radio, 774, and his positions include chairing the committee of the National Trust of Victoria's Register of Significant Trees. Dr. Judy Bush, who lectures in urban planning at the University of Melbourne. Her research focuses on urban environmental policy and governance, including governance and policy approaches for nature-based solutions, biodiversity, urban ecology, and climate change perspectives. Judy's going to speak about approaches to protecting and retraining trees on private land. And Chris Spencer, who's the team leader arborist at the City of Boroondara, will speak about tree protection in Boroondara, the strategies to improve tree canopy and the challenges faced.
Thank you. It's great to see so many people out in a slightly less green and leafy Boroondara than I remember a few years ago. So I'm going to cut straight to the chase. I've got about 15 minutes to talk to you, and I'm going to try and be on time. I don't need to remind an audience like this of the benefits of street trees, and this is just of trees in general. This is just a back of an envelope list, and I could talk about almost any of those for somewhere between 3 hours and 3 weeks, and so you're in for a bit of a treat. But I just wanted to illustrate how many of these there are and how little we know about quite a number of them. And in fact, I also wanted to illustrate that the list has expanded, because when I did a back of an envelope list, say 20 years ago, you come up with about a dozen, maybe 15. And then when I did it a couple of years ago, I ran out of space on the back of the envelope. You just can't fit them all in. So it shows you that we're starting to understand more and more how dependent we are upon a treed and green and leafy urban space for a sustainable and livable city. The other thing that I wanted to sort of highlight is that we've known about certain things for a long time. So I take great interest in the scientific journals, as you can see. And when something like the Herald Sun, after 20 years of denial, suddenly comes out and says, you know, climate change might have an effect, you go, whoa, geez, someone's woken up. And then you read the heading here. It says, leafy suburbs, cool in the shade, sweltering west, green with envy. Can you imagine the joy of the subby coming up with that headline? Green with envy. And then a tree breeze blows. When you read the article, because I live in the west of Melbourne, it's absolutely infuriating. Because it basically says, if you live in a green and leafy suburb, you're not going to die in a heat wave. Aren't you lucky? Okay? Now, if they knew back then that people were going to die in heat waves, why the hell haven't they done something about it since? And I'm talking about the state government here. So I found this really offensive, to be perfectly honest. It got up my goat. Now, okay, I've also caught the vibe that trees are in. Have you caught that vibe? Now people are talking about trees. They never did before, but now people are talking about trees. Well, so what? What's the talk about? How many less trees have been demolished because people are interested? None. The same, they're gone. Okay, we're still losing about 1 to 1.5% canopy cover in most suburbs, even in newer and less treed suburbs, because essentially of the redevelopment of large blocks. And this is happening all over the place. And by the way, Melbourne is not a green and leafy city, despite what we might think. We don't have actually urban forests for the most part. If you want to get technical, most of our urban forests would be lucky to be urban woodlands or low or open woodlands, but that's another matter. And about half the suburbs in most of our capital cities have under 20% canopy cover, so they're far from green and leafy. And that figure of about 1 to 1.5% of the vegetation being lost in these suburbs is pretty much the same as you find in the United States, for example, where they're undergoing similar sort of development phases. And what this does is it means that if you've got a target of canopy for the future, it's going to be very hard to reach, as we'll talk about in a second. Now, one of the things I've discovered over the years is that people will remember there's a bloke that talked about trees. That's me, by the way. But what his name is, they'll forget. You'll have forgotten by the time you get home to have a cup of tea. And you'll have forgotten most of the technical stuff we're telling you. So I want to get a few simple messages across. And the first one I want to ask is 30% a magical arboricultural number. And I am saying this a little bit tongue-in-cheek because there are some scientists in this room and I don't want to be found wanting. But I also want to make a serious point. First and foremost, a forest has long been defined in Australia as a community of plants where the tree cover is greater than 30%, 30% or above. Magic number. To maximise the benefits of urban canopy cover, you need about 30% canopy cover. There's a law of diminishing returns. So as you increase the canopy cover, you get more and more returns and then it starts to level off. So 30% again comes out as an interesting number. Interesting work done in Brisbane showed that when people were buying a property, the value of the property went up with trees on it as the canopy cover increased until you got to about 30% and then the value dropped. They weren't prepared to pay as much. That tells you that Aussies want trees, but they don't want too many of them. So when you come down to this, what we should be all aspiring to is a general 30% canopy cover. Now, do we get this? Are we going to get this? Well, it's interesting. This is the targeted canopy cover that came from the Nature Conservancy work in 2019. Now, you can imagine that there are certain things about this I really like. So you'll notice eastern suburbs, canopy target 30%. Inner, 27.5%. Why it's not 30, don't ask me, but 2.5%. I'm not going to quibble too much. Inner southeastern, 30%. Northern, 27%. Southern, 30%. And of course, then you get down to western, aspiring to 19%. So what are you doing there? You're entrenching the disadvantage of the people of the west. You're actually going to ensure that more of them die than anywhere else in Melbourne. How the hell can you justify that sort of a figure? Okay? So, yeah, did it get up my nose? You did. You bet it did. Just like the Herald Sun article. Don't accept that figure at all because what happened in the West before Europeans came doesn't matter. Now it's just a suburb, a bloody great big suburb, tiny little box, lots of houses, hot as hell, people will die. We know it. Where is the responsibility? So, thinking about all of this, maybe we should start talking about our urban forests as urban woodlands just to make a point and to get up people's noses because the language really matters. Okay? If you think you've got an urban forest, everyone goes, well, we've got an urban forest. That's pretty good. Well, no, we don't have an urban forest. We haven't had one, and the odds of us having one in the future are pretty low. But we still want more canopy cover. So, given that this is all nice and sort of going well, it's great to have targets, but you should be aspiring to real targets and targets that challenge you. You can't say, well, they don't have that many trees in that area, then we won't aspire to 30% because they mightn't reach it by 2040. Because if you don't have the higher target, the one thing you can be sure of is you'll never get there. That's the one thing you can be sure of. Now, in relation to climate change, how alert are we and how sort of up-to-date are we with climate change? Well, I do a lot of these sorts of talks, about 30 or 40 a year for the last 30 years. So it's a fair few, and I mix with a lot of people. And what I find is, people know that it's going to get warmer. Tick, pretty much. Haven't had an argument about that for at least a decade and a half. Many of them sort of aware that it's going to get drier, but they don't really know what the implication of a warmer atmosphere is. They don't realise more energy. More energy means stronger winds, more storms from the east, okay? What's that going to mean? It means we're in for a bit of a tough time in terms of trees falling over. That's what it means. They also seem to be unaware of the fact that when it does rain, it'll rain more heavily, okay? Isn't this terrible news for Melbourne? We're going to have weather just like Sydney. Bloody awful. And I can't help a little bit of colloquialism here. And the heavier rainfall is going to be in the drier months, which means the effective precipitation is going to be actually lower. So a 10% reduction in rainfall will probably be somewhere between 12 and 15% in effect. Now, the benefits from street trees, I spelled out a bit earlier, but I thought I'd just put up a couple for you. This is from a brilliant study of the effect of greenness, and greenness in this study means tree green space, in the United States on women's health. And you'll notice here there's some very interesting things here. For example, higher birth weights of babies, less use of pharmaceutical prescription drugs, less self-harm, increased human resilience, reduced social disadvantage, quicker recovery from hospitalisation. All of these, lots and lots of data to support them, because this was a metadata study brought to my attention by my son. And another interesting one in this that I've just thought I'd put up, lower overall crime rates. All those people running around saying, oh, if you put trees, the villains will hide behind them and crime rates will go up. Now, this is an urban myth, and let's get rid of it once and for all. If you live in a green and leafier suburb, you have a lower crime rate. Okay, so it's in everyone's interest to have more trees. Heat waves killed. Black Saturday, 173 people died in the fires, 374 died in the heat wave that surrounded it. The one thing I can tell you now, the way Melbourne is going, there will be greater numbers of heat wave related deaths. Where will they be? Mainly in the west of Melbourne, a little bit to the south, and fortunately, if you want to look at the stats and you want to catch up, the more trees removed from the east, the closer you'll get to matching the death figures in the west. And the way the south, east and east of Melbourne is going, you're doing a bloody good job. Okay, so you'll get there. A couple of other things in terms of health. At TreeNet in 2016, first three speakers, nothing to do with trees. What were they? They were medicos and epidemiologists. We didn't know what the hell an epidemiologist was back in 2016. How naive. But they came up with two interesting figures. One chap got up and said, you know, if you had more treed green space, you'd save $800 million a year in type 2 diabetes costs. $800 million a year. Can you imagine me as a tree person? We wouldn't get that for an entire country in a decade. It's a massive amount of money. And then another one got up and said, you'd save $4.2 billion in blood pressure and heart-related diseases. Now, I'm really good at maths. I went, that's $5 billion. I can remember a figure like $5 billion, okay? $5 billion a year. And then the person said, oh, by the way, it's not rocket science. If you have tree green space, people will exercise. If they exercise, these two conditions are related to obesity and people being overweight. That's where you make the money. It's a huge amount of money and would make a huge difference to the Australian economy and the way we sort of look at vegetation. So my question now is, if we know these things about type 2 diabetes, and we know these things about human health and well-being, and we know about heat wave-related deaths, if you don't do anything, when does it turn from being ignorance to negligence? Now that's what I want to ask. I would argue that at a state government level, because at local government level, I know everyone in every suburb loves to have a shot at their local council. It's not the council here that's the issue, it's the state planning framework. That's the issue. And the way that's interpreted by VCAT. Because we just couldn't believe that trees and green space could do so much for so little cost. You know, we just didn't know. Well, no, that doesn't cut it. There is now so much information out there that if you don't do something, why aren't you negligent and why aren't you held accountable and responsible? And maybe the last federal election was the beginning of that accountability and that responsibility being brought home to the politicians of our nation. Now, on a national basis, 95% of the, 97% of the requests for tree removals are ultimately approved. Victoria, obviously much more environmentally friendly, 95% here. Now, it's not carte blanche, and you don't automatically get to remove a tree the first time you ask. But when people say, oh, the council, the local government wouldn't let us do this stuff, you can almost bet your boots that they haven't asked. Because you might have to ask 2 or 3 times, maybe even 4 times, but usually the tree will go. So, we're losing 1.5% canopy cover, most on private space. The tree removals are still being approved at a very high rate, and we're not taking action. Why isn't it negligence? I'll leave the rest to our other speakers.
Thanks, Greg. So I'm going to talk about the policy perspectives. Also like to start by acknowledging traditional owners, Australia, incredible diversity of cultural heritage, custodianship of country, deep cultural knowledge and cultural heritage that has created the biodiversity that we all share now. This is from the report that Greg actually referred to, developed by Nature Conservancy and Resilient Melbourne, and you can see urbanisation processes at work. On the left we've got older style housing with great big huge backyards, and look at all those trees, replaced by much larger housing and very little space for trees. On the right we can see multi-unit development, and again very little space for trees. So in our urbanisation processes, this is where the tree loss is happening. So when we think about cities and urban trees, it may be helpful to think about those different urban development stages and processes. So in growth areas, for example, and urban renewal areas, we can think about precinct planning, street planning and design, and making sure that there is space for trees in that design process. Then in the construction phase, of course, is another point at which trees can very much be lost. And so, again, how can we focus on tree survival during construction? And then, of course, the planting, establishment and maintenance phase is critical for creating and maintaining healthy trees. Some of those challenges and constraints for trees, as you can see on the slide, lack of space, and that was very strongly communicated in that previous slide. So it's not just about above ground lack of space, it's also below ground lack of space. So where utilities are located, and if utilities like underground services need to be dug up, if the tree has been planted on top of those utilities, then that's not looking good for the tree. Of course, some of the other challenges and constraints for urban trees relate to poor growing conditions, lack of water and so on. Maybe also the wrong species, and there's been increasing research looking at temperature tolerances as well as moisture tolerances of street tree species. Also thinking about temperature tolerances as the city gets hotter. And then, of course, there's damage, disturbance and vandalism, which also has an effect on our trees. So some of the success factors, I was involved in a research project for Victorian Planning Authority. They were looking at the magic number of 30% canopy cover for growth areas and looking to see whether that was feasible to look at setting a canopy target in growth areas. And so some of those success factors that we identified in establishing and maintaining trees in growth areas were related to objectives, goals and targets, ambitious targets. Space for trees, both above ground and below ground, thinking about species selection, really focusing on precinct and street design. So, for example, making sure that there's space along the nature strip to actually locate a tree, thinking about having adjacent crossovers next to each other to expand the amount of space for the tree between them. Growing conditions, making sure they're being planted into decent soil, and then really importantly, community and organisational support and funding and allocation of resources. So let's think about some of the policy mechanisms. So research on policy has said, okay, there are a number of different ways that policy achieves its objectives. It's not just about regulation. Often when people talk about policy, they assume it's how can we make someone do something through regulation. But I think it's helpful to remember that policy mechanisms, the way objectives are achieved in policies, is more than regulation. Regulation is one. There's also government provision and demonstration, information and community engagement, incentives, awards and grants. And these authors, Madison and Dennis, suggested that a single mechanism is unlikely to be sufficient for environmental policies that aim to address sustainability issues in complex systems. So don't just rely on regulation when you're thinking about tree preservation and more. So let's have a think about some of those policy mechanisms that might relate to trees on private land. So information and community engagement, including guidelines and brochures and community events and so on, supported by local government. Incentives, awards and grants are actually an important way of raising the profile and sense of community support. Premier Sustainability Awards, for example. So Boroondara actually have awards. Maybe there's an opportunity to have a Tree Stewardship Award as part of Boroondara's portfolio of awards. And then regulations. So, of course, regulations include, for example, planning scheme provisions, zones and overlays, local laws as well, maybe tree bonds that can be applied during a construction process. The really important thing to remember with regulation is that it requires enforcement to be effective. So if people know that regulations aren't enforced, then they lose any power that they might otherwise have. So I'd argue that those 4 different types of mechanisms can work together to support a transition to more nature-based cities. And so regulatory mechanisms are really there to set the minimum standards, and incentives and awards and so on are there to recognise and reward innovation and push best practice and really encourage better performance. There are situations where policy mechanisms haven't been set in a way to achieve objectives, and so we can actually think of policy mechanisms for example, where the regulatory mechanism specifies the maximum standards and prevents you from doing better, or where incentives mechanisms like grants just operate to maintain business as usual. So really important to focus on making sure that the policy mechanisms have been set in a way to actually push best practice. Arguably too, there are a whole range of success factors that go into effective policy. And I think, Greg, in your presentation, you referred to a number of these. So, having ambitious goals and targets, having leaders and champions who are prepared to make decisions related to trees. So that's in the strategic section. In the tactical, that's about alliances and partnership, community engagement, really building that support. In the operational sphere, it's around ensuring that there are the technical skills, the resources for implementation. And then the reflexive is around monitoring and evaluation and keeping track of what our tree canopy cover is looking like. So, conclusions. Yes, it's challenging. The challenges we're facing, increasing greening in private land as well as public land. Planning needs to take account during the development process, across the life stages of the built environment, definitely during redevelopment. Planning needs to consider residential, commercial and industrial contexts. We've maybe been talking mostly about residential, but there are a lot of opportunities in commercial contexts. And really thinking about creating that urban nature network across both public and private land, because certainly to address issues of urban heat and so on, it's super important to have that network created. And so to effectively green our cities, increase the greening, we need to do a number of these things all at once. We need to combine policies, planning schemes, local laws, financial incentives. We can't just rely on regulation. We need to set and enforce minimum standards. Again, it's not enough to just set minimum standards, we need to make sure we're enforcing them. But then we also need to encourage positive behaviour, and we need to engage community and foster a sense of collective stewardship of our urban environments and our trees. And effective policymakers need to be able to then combine the good evidence, the increasing evidence that certainly Greg pointed to be able to support continuing strengthening of policy. And I would argue that a key part of that is fostering our connections with nature and our connections with place, because trees are very evocative of place and those connections. So thanks very much.
Spencer, I'm here from the City of Boroondara. I'm the team leader arborist in the planning department. I'm here to talk about tree protection, some of the challenges and the strategies that Boroondara are putting in place and that we face. To do that, I want to ask and answer 6 questions. So what do we have? How do we protect it? How do we manage it? What are our challenges? What do we need? And how can you help? So what do we have? So we are the highest rated urban compact low rainfall city in Australia. So these are results from a survey published in 2020 by Greener Spaces, Better Places. But they benchmarked councils across Australia and in relation to their canopy cover. The survey compares us to similar municipalities across the country. Think places like the City of Melbourne, Burnley, City of Stonington, Glenara. And I think we should be really proud of this result in Boroondara. I mean, we've really largely inherited a really old forest, and that those trees have grown in a really low density landscape. But our landscape's changing, and because of that, the space available is really reduced. So what do we have? So we've got about 110,000 public trees, streets and parks. We reckon we've got about 200,000 trees total on public and private land. We plant about 1,000 trees every year on public land, and we're increasing that to about 2,000 every year as part of our climate action plan. We're targeting about 14,000 street trees to be planted by 2030. There are a broad range of canopy cover assessments done for the municipality over the last few years, and they get mixed results depending on how the study was done. We currently estimate our canopy cover to be about 25%, and there's an in-depth canopy cover assessment being done at the moment by a private consultant. It's hopefully going to be delivered soon. It's going to be producing high resolution or not so high resolution imagery like the one on the right here. This is showing the red is indicating canopy cover and canopy health. The studies, when it comes back, is going to be able to identify things like tree health, stress across the entire municipality. It's going to be able to be broken down to neighbourhood precincts, council wards, and hopefully the information, as far as I've been advised, is going to be able to look at things like carbon stored. It's going to be look at tree species and be able to identify tree species to a certain extent, and most importantly, it's going to be able to identify where we've got space for new trees. So how do we protect it? So we have a range of mechanisms. I'll just talk briefly to each one. We have a tree protection local law that's been in operation since 2006. It requires a permit to remove or work within 2 metres of a canopy tree, and it requires a permit to prune, remove or work within the tree protection zone of a significant tree. Significant trees are identified they're nominated by the community. They are part of our significant tree register, and each one of those trees is assessed in accordance with the National Trust criteria. Our canopy trees are defined by their trunk diameter, so at 1.5 metres above ground level, they need to be greater than 110 centimetres in diameter, in circumference. Sorry. We have 2 overlays. We have a significant landscape overlay that mainly operates along the Yarra, and we have a vegetation protection overlay that operates at the Kew cottages. Our amenity local law predominantly works with trees on private land that are affecting public land, and our asset control local law provides some level of protection for our trees on public land. So how do we manage it? So we have around about 17 arborists or landscape professionals working across 2 departments. we undertake thousands of inspections every year. We undertake cyclic inspections of all our park and street trees. We undertake inspections on private land as part of local law applications. We've commenced recently some proactive inspections of building sites, trying to check that trees are being planted when they're needed to be, and making sure that builders are protecting trees. We're exploring ways to try and proactively engage. I think, as Judy said, sometimes it's not always the stick, that you need to that incentivises compliance. You really need to encourage people to do the right thing. And how do we do that and recognise those good behaviours? And we're also looking at trying to improve the technology that we have to collect the information when we're out on site. So how do we manage it on private land? So this is my role. My role is related to private land. And this slide represents a broad summary of what my team does every year. So I have 4 arborists, or 3.5 arborists, 1 part-time, assessing over close to 1,000 applications under the local law each year. We're doing the preliminary assessment of significant tree nominations. We are doing local law appeals, and when people get a refusal decision under our local law, they have an opportunity to appeal it. We provide planning advice, we provide information to the community, just general inquiries. We're investigating over 200 enforcement matters every year. If you work that number out, like on how many days you work in a year, it's almost one a day. In relation to the local law applications, they're really complex. We get reports from engineers, plumbers, allergists, from psychologists, from lawyers, from doctors, landscape architects, builders. They are piling on the information to try and get the outcome that they want. I've got a different statistic than you, Greg, in relation to how many we're approving. So we keep statistics for all the local law applications that we've received over the last 16 years. For the last 5 years, it's been about 65% would be approved. And this is for tree removal, works within 2 metres of a canopy tree, and just general works to significant trees. We get, of the applications that are refused, we get around about 80 appeals. And usually when it gets to an appeal process, it really escalates in terms of the amount of supporting information that comes in. About 30% of our approvals for removal are purely to do with development. A lot of trees that we're allowing to be removed are being removed because of health, structure, risk, or damage to property, or they might be trees that we consider to be low value. So they're weed species, they're small trees that are never really going to attain a significant amount of height and could probably be easily replaced in a more appropriate location. In relation to enforcement, we investigate every single complaint that comes in. So if you see something you don't and you're not sure whether it should be happening, tell us. About 50% of these result in an infringement, or a prosecution, or a notice being issued for a replacement tree, or for a tree to be protected. And as part of our climate action plan, we've recently appointed a landscape compliance officer. Their role is primarily to be proactive in the community, to go and check on building sites, making sure that trees are being planted as part of multi-unit developments, issuing out reminders for local law permits that have been issued where people are required to plant a tree. And so what are our challenges? So the community's been really clear that trees and green space are important. They're a core part of our community, the Boroondara Community Plan and our Climate Action Plan. But we hear a range of opinions about trees, different perspectives about trees. And there are often competing priorities and values and outcomes, and often we're not the only decision makers. So what are our challenges? I know Greg said on one of the first slides he could talk for 3 hours to 3 weeks on the benefits of trees. I could probably do the same on the challenges. So I'm going to talk to my notes here because there's a lot of information. Our most common battle is over space. Space on private land, on space on public land. New developments fill the land with buildings, as we saw in Judy's slide. And that remaining area is filled with things such as tennis courts, sheds, decks and pergolas. And all those last things I mentioned are actually considered garden area under the building regulations. So new driveways can often require street trees to be removed. They take away space for a new tree to be planted in the future. They can cause damage, they can cause future conflicts. Trees are valued differently in the community. And those values can change, really quickly. Over time, people's needs change on their property. They start to, as trees grow, they interact with structures, and so which result in costs. And after a severe weather event, people's values can change really quickly. The tree that was once a tree they loved and cherished in their backyard is all of a sudden, a danger to them. Often trees are not valued by councils as assets, which means that their true value, like their amenity value, their ecological benefits or environmental benefits, are not truly understood or represented when they're being considered for removal. There's more pressure from builders to build closer, build more, build over all the space that was once there, as we saw in the slides before. Landscape professionals, architects and arborists are often pushing the boundaries for clients to achieve their development outcomes. And in my opinion, they're not considering trees enough and not providing enough space. Builders are often including conditions on their contracts that require all trees to be removed. And if someone wants to keep a tree on their land as part of a build, they're often being charged tens of thousands of dollars to keep it in additional costs. Real estate agents have been known to encourage sellers to remove trees before they sell, sometimes without permission. Electrical Services Victoria, so the ESV, who oversees or sets the rules and the guidelines for the clearing of tree canopy away from power lines, they place really high demands on the municipality to maintain the clearance requirements. And that really affects how much canopy we can grow, and it also affects which trees we can retain. And sections of our community are actively trying to ignore the rules or break the law, and the disincentives are grossly inadequate. And the last thing here is the Building Act. The Building Act doesn't consider trees. It doesn't consider the impacts on trees, and it doesn't even consider trees at all. So what do we need? So we're not doing this alone. A lot of municipalities don't have tree protection controls or regulations. The state government drafted an urban cooling and greening clause last year, and it would cover all of metropolitan Melbourne. It's still being considered at the moment. It would provide consistency across all councils. It would be less confusion for contractors, and most importantly, it would make trees and canopy cover a core part of the decision making for a single dwelling. We really need the community to plant trees. You'd think it's really easy, but it's not. People get permission to remove a tree, and we have to send reminder after reminder to get them to plant a tree. And sometimes they just prefer to pay the fine and not plant the tree. And also, I see you, this audience, as a resource. You see things in your street, and if you see something that you don't think should be happening, tell us about it. We've got a really good resource base here in Boroondara with arborists. We will investigate. We need better design. We need trees to be considered really early in the process and to be given plenty of space. We need the ESV, so the Electrical Services Victoria, to approve alternative compliances, things like reduced pruning, if we're going to kind of monitor and inspect them more regularly. Engineering solutions, things like aerial bundle cable, so that big black cable you'll see instead of the floor span. Underground, there's a whole range of different engineering solutions that could be used. We need gardens to be green, not blue, not grey, green. Contractors need to be educated, and I think they need to be acknowledged when they do the right thing. And so that's certainly something that our landscape compliance officer is looking at. The penalties need to be greater, and we need the Building Act to be a tree act. We need to consider trees more strongly. So how can you help? So if you see something unacceptable or concerning, tell us. If you see something, what's on the left here, that's what we're kind of looking for on a building site. Plenty of space around the tree, fencing, some ground protection, the black matting down the bottom there. If you see something on the right, tell us about it. If you see something, tell us. Don't wait till the end of the day, don't wait till the end of the week, don't wait till a month or 2 months or 2 years later. Tell us when you see it and we'll investigate it. If you see a demolition company or a builder doing one of these things on the right-hand side here, tell us about it. If you're building a house yourself or your neighbour is, talk to them about what they're doing with the tree and check that they're trying to looking after it. And if you see a multi-unit development, there's usually a landscape plan as part of that. If you see a tree get planted and then just mysteriously disappear later on, tell us about it and we'll go and investigate. We can make people put these things back on. If you want to see a change to the Building Act or the Infringements Act that sets the amount of fine, or the Electrical Services Act that tells us how much we need to prune, talk to your local state member. You know, we need to advocate to these people to make the changes we want to see. And last thing, if you've got space on your land, plant a tree. Yeah, or gift a tree to your neighbour. Yeah, if they've got space on their land. If you've seen one of your friends or neighbours that has removed a tree with a permit and haven't replaced it, remind them they need to replace it. And you know, if you've got a neighbour that you know wants to remove a tree and you kind of feel like it's probably a tree that we should be looking after, talk to them about the values of the trees. And so my last slide, just 4 kind of key words. Call and report if you see something. Yeah, we respond. We respond within half an hour usually, you know, and often we can do less because we might have an arborist already out on site. You know, advocate to your local parliamentarian if you want to see some bigger changes to state government. And if you have a tree that you love and you think other people should know about or love as well, then nominate it. That's it. Thank you. The first question I have here is, does the City of Boroondara collect statistics about the clearance of trees from private land holdings? So I suppose I'm taking that as not from private land, but from kind of commercial land, or from land that might be owned by like a proprietary limited. I suppose the easy to answer for that one is that any tree on private land, we collect statistics. If there's an application for it, then we'll have information, a report is compiled for every single application. And if it's been removed illegally, then we keep that information as well. If that hasn't answered your question, then come and see me afterwards. The next question I have here is, does Boroondara own or use ultrasound technology for assessment of the tree structural integrity, and what can you tell us about its effectiveness in protecting trees? The answer is we don't own one, but we routinely recommend tree owners if they are to get that kind of testing done. So there's Arbortom and Picus are the 2 tools. There's a couple of companies in Victoria that use it. So yeah, quite routinely, if we see a piece of decay or a cavity or something we're not sure about, then yeah, we certainly recommend that. I'll do one more. Given the importance of street trees as part of our tree coverage, what is the Council's plan for managing trees and ensuring their health? So certainly the canopy cover assessment that we're doing is going to be looking at a broad assessment of our trees, so we can get a much bigger picture of tree health over the year, looking at tree species, which trees are ageing, which tree areas we need to prioritise in terms of replacement. Cool, I'll pass over to you, Judy.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got a bunch of questions here, and many of them I don't know the answers to. They're quite statutory planning related, really. So in the City of Whitehorse, most trees are in private domain. The loophole of dangerous trees leads to trees protected by the planning scheme being taken down. Is there a standard for deciding the danger of trees other than a look over from a certificated arborist? What do you think, Chris?
In terms of tree assessment?
Yeah, tree assessment for dangerous trees.
Depends on the council, but certainly our council, we have 4 qualified arborists. We undertake a full visual tree assessment for every tree that comes in for an application. We do a risk assessment in accordance with International Society of Arboriculture Tree Risk Assessment Qualification, which we're all independently accredited for. And if we feel like there's further information we need, then we ask for it. So diagnostic testing, whether that be sonic tomography for the trunk, whether that be root plate stability testing, whether that be an aerial inspection.
So do you know if Whitehorse also has the same tree protections that Boroondara has? Because it sounds like Boroondara has relatively strong local laws to protect trees. I know in my municipality, which we won't name, they don't have those protections. So Boroondara is starting from a better policy point.
My understanding is Whitehorse has a blanket overlay, is that right? Or is a vegetation protection overlay? So, you know, that's probably as equal or more kind of control than Boroondara. Probably often comes down to the resourcing. I know Moonee Valley has a local law very similar to the City of Boroondara, and they don't have the resources to kind of have an arborist go out and have a look at every single tree. We're very, very lucky here at Boroondara that, you know, there's been resources and money and funding invested into the team to get the qualified people there.
And I know in my municipality, trees on private land don't have those same protections, because I've run council, like you said, crying on the phone after trees on private land have been cut down and told by council, sorry, there's nothing we can do. So it does depend on which local government area you're in. Over to you, Greg.
Okay. I've got a couple here that I'll try and combine. The first one was about no one mentioning the education of young people in relation to the benefits of trees. I think that's really important, but the truth is that the younger generation is not the problem. If you talk to them, they know the value of the trees. It's the people who are in power that are the problem. They're the ones that need re-educating. I can tell you my grandkids don't need to be told about the value of trees, and they certainly help me out on certain occasions.
I'd like to add to that our industry has a skills shortage at the moment. So, you know, it's a great industry. I've been in this industry for over 20 years. If you've got a young person that wants to get into the industry, please advocate and encourage them.
The industry is running a campaign called Arborists Don't Grow on Trees at the moment. and interestingly enough, as an arboricultural educator, they're absolutely right. Victoria is well placed with arborists, and we're short, but if you go to other states, the need is dire. The next question I have is, what can you do when a cowboy just removes a tree? And I'm linking that to a second question was, if you remove an established tree, what's an adequate replacement? How do you ensure an adequate replacement? The first one, I think trees should have an established dollar value. And so a good tree, let's say it's worth $50,000, which is not an unreasonable value. If someone legally removes it, you charge them 100 grand. It's simple as that. Now, if you're thinking this is pie in the sky, it's not as pie in the sky as you might think. Germany, the tree value system is linked to their lower courts, so no one argues about the value of the tree. They might argue about the condition, but once you agree on the condition of the tree, the value is established in their court system. Arboriculture Australia has just released what they call a minimum industry standard on tree valuation, which will bring together, I think, a system for Australia-wide where people will put a dollar value on a tree. And I think if you do that, then all of a sudden it's going to have a huge impact. You may be interested to know that Standards Australia has tried several times to work with the industry to put a dollar or a system for putting a dollar value on the tree, and each time Standards Australia was overwhelmed. They walked away from it because there are so many interest groups that are opposed to it. I can tell you this is absolutely true, there were more complaints and opposition letters to Standards Australia over putting a value on tree than there was over standards related to baby deaths. Every utility, every road authority, every insurance company in the nation opposed putting a dollar value on trees. So you can work that one out. And just to finish up on that question, if you remove a large tree, nobody should cop the we'll replace it with one tree. So there are formula out there that you can use. So to give you an idea, if you wanted to replace the shade of one large tree within a year, you might need 150 to 500 trees. Young trees, right? No one's expecting that. So what do? You say, well, what are the services the tree is providing? And what period of time do we want them replaced by? Let's say 5 to 10 years. Okay. If you go along that path, every tree large tree that's removed, you should be looking at somewhere between 8 and 20 replacement trees. So that's a simple formula. It's much more complex than I've made it sound. There's some beautiful scientific papers and statistical papers on it. So, but we do know anyone that tries to sell you a one for one is really just selling you a pup. I'll pass to someone else.
I was thinking about the tree valuation thing. My memory is that City of Melbourne have valued their trees in their public open space.
Yes.
And the Royal Children's Hospital, the original plans for that were going to involve, removal of a number of trees, and the City of Melbourne applied their tree valuation to it, and the plans for the hospital were changed so that they could retain those trees. So
That is correct.
yeah, good. So that's a good example of that application, but the limitation of that is that it only applies to City of Melbourne's trees, not to private trees.
No, well,
Is
that's
that right?
Melbourne City Council has
Yeah.
a formula that's widely used.
Yeah.
There are other formula. The Burnley one is probably the most common used in Victoria. The Thayer method is the one that's most commonly used in New South Wales. These methods have been around for the best part of 40 years, and they can be used on, depending on the method, on private or public land.
Yeah.
And for those of you that are sort of vaguely interested, a really good elm tree would be worth maybe $45,000. A really massive Moreton Bay fig might come out at $120,000 or $150,000, depending on size and age. A really good eucalypt could be anything around $30,000 to $40,000. So you get a feeling for the value of this. And in other societies, as I said, these systems are just accepted. And in some other parts of the world, they have some very interesting systems. So the idea that in Melbourne and Victoria, you own a tree on your land, you have all the costs, but the general community gets some of the benefit. And this is recognised in other places as an issue. So in places like Hawaii, for example, you can get a $3,000 grant every 3 years to maintain a tree that's regarded as providing a big community benefit. Now, you can't get the money, it's not a scam. You've got to prove that you need to do something to the tree or that you can't afford the mulch and all that sort of stuff. But what it recognises is that trees have a bigger effect than just on an individual's property or on that individual's life. And I think we're going to move to something like that. In the US, in some states, you can get a tax deduction for your house trees.
Yeah. And I think they're really exciting examples because they do move beyond that whole idea of just how can we stop people chopping down trees, but actually acknowledging tree stewardship and those wider contributions. So, yeah, great examples.
My turn again? Okay, the question I have here is, we have a complex problem. We want to encourage high density living in the city. Sustainability and nature must be central to our experience. However, council's target for canopy cover on public land is too low. Double the number of street trees and interplant between each street tree. Why are our new canopy targets on public land so low? And can we get a purchase some wholesale rates for trees? So I suppose some councils have their own nurseries, so they can provide trees to the community. I'm not aware that Boroondara has that system in place. In relation to planting trees in streets and more, look, streets are really full of things. They're full of power lines, they're full of infrastructure underneath, they're full of pits, they're full of driveways. You need to have adequate sight lines for vehicles to exit and enter their driveways and around corners and intersections. So certainly, we try to plant as many trees as we can and in the right space, and you want them to survive. Trees interact with things around them, so there's no, just planting more trees isn't necessarily the answer.
Can I add to that I mentioned we did some work for Victorian Planning Authority last year, which was looking at exactly those issues of how can we increase street tree canopy cover, and it is about the precinct design as well as the street layout itself. So I mentioned that briefly in my presentation, but thinking about where the crossover locations are and median strips in boulevard roads and aspects like that. So really thinking about how to maximise the space for trees while still providing those other benefits. And in fact, I've heard some investigation of the idea of putting underground services under footpaths rather than under nature strips. At the moment, many nature strips are actually utility strips rather than nature strips. So the idea of putting them under footpaths so that you can actually have some hope of establishing decent trees is really, another interesting idea.
Okay, I'll just combine a few more here if I can, and I'll do them as quickly as I can. Someone's asked, why can't we get VicTrack to plant trees along railway lines? Yeah, good luck with that. If you want to think of, as I do, Vic Roads, villains, and Major Road Victoria, villains, Energy Safe Victoria, villains. Now, if you want to put them in one side of the equation, their villainy goes nowhere near VicTrack. So if you talk to any other government authority, VicTrack is loathed with a passion. The only people that don't know it are the people that work for VicTrack. They're shockers. Sorry I had to pull the punches there. Second one, in relation to the Victorian government chopping down tens of thousands of trees, yeah, well, don't you wish John Cleese and Monty Python were here? Can you imagine what they do? So, for example, you think it's bad on this side because of what's happening with the North East Link project, and you ought to be really cheesed off with that, okay? Because yes, you've been sort of snowed about how many replacements and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, look at what they're doing in the west. Got no trees there. So what do? They knock out thousands and thousands of them for the tunnel, okay, the Westgate Tunnel. Then there's a bit of a site out in Eastern Albans where they created an urban forest, okay, gave money, planted the forest came up brilliantly. Then they sold the land to the developers because they've got a forest on it. First thing they did was remove all the trees. So the state government does not have a good record on this, in any part of Melbourne, and it doesn't matter. I have no time for party politics. They're all villains, okay, and they've all done much the same thing. So it's pretty ordinary stuff. In relation to artificial turf, okay, artificial turf. Where do you start? Huge amount of embedded carbon, hot as hell in summer, so hot that on some of the artificial turf, you can't play on a really hot day. So why have you got artificial turf? Because the demands for recreational space are so high. So local government is caught in a vice here. They want more space, they've got to use the space more often, natural turf won't stand up to it. But whoever asked that question really sort of landed on something. And the issue, just while I've got the microphone, if you look at your public open space, what you're going to find is that trees around your sporting reserves and on your sporting land are going to be under enormous pressure because of the demands for sporting facilities. So in lots of places, trees are being taken out on large spaces so you can put in an extra basketball court. And if you think you've got some political lobbying power in this room, just compare it to the local soccer club, because you've got nothing. Okay, compare it to the local football club and cricket club. You've got nothing. Okay, once alcohol gets involved, you need a few more drinks and a bit of money. And the last one is, in terms of just sort of how can it be so easy just to clear fell a block before you build on it? How can that happen? And the answer is it's not a local government issue, you know that. That's state government planning framework. And until they change it, it's just going to keep happening.
Thanks, Greg. I got a question here about tree planting. So why does council still plant English plane trees, sometimes only a few metres apart from other similar species? Look, I know that we still, those trees are really resilient. I think there's a phasing out of some of those tree species over time. But some of those, they're robust and they survive. I've got here, especially when the taxpayer asks specifically for more suitable native species. I think for any kind of very specific sites around Boroondara, if you've got kind of questions and concerns, it's probably best to kind of contact Boroondara and you'll get a very specific response. I'm not aware of this particular one.
Can I just chip in there? I mean, one of the things about plane trees is, as Chris has said, they are really, really resilient. And I wouldn't be rushing out to get rid of big ones at the moment unless you can absolutely guarantee that you're going to get good replacement species. And the other thing that sort of I find it really annoying at times, do you know how long things like elms, oaks and plane trees have been selected for urban use? Sometimes going back to the Romans, you know, thousands of years. How much time and effort has been put into breeding the best spotted gum? Now, on record, spotted gum, great trees. You've got some real rippers, okay, that you could plant. How much has been spent breeding and selecting? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. You look at yellow gum, leucoxylon. How much money has been spent on breeding and selecting? $30,000. I can tell you exactly $30,000. No more than that. And you want our native species to perform in exactly the same way as these highly bred, highly selected and tested exotics. Now, I'm all for the natives, but let's get realistic here. And why is it that Australians always exploit our resources rather than develop them? You know, the whole philosophy here has to be thought through.
So it feels slightly dangerous following up with this question. Would it be possible for tree species selection to include those that provide good habitat for wildlife with food available for them throughout the year? So, yes. Shall I hand over to you? So, for me, this also reinforces the importance of having a network. You know, it's not just about one tree, it's about creating a habitat network across our city. And yeah, I want to put in a good word for urban biodiversity. Cities are hotspots for biodiversity. There are definitely threatened species that live in cities, and there are some threatened species in Australia that are restricted to urban areas. So we can't just assume that, you know, that national park out there is going to look after biodiversity. So street trees and trees in private gardens are a really important contributor to habitat. I think continuing planting, we need to think about, you know, trees that actually are up for the job. We also need to, as I mentioned briefly, look at temperature sensitivities of trees as our cities continue to get hotter. But definitely we need to think about trees as habitat. That's super important. Habitat for us, habitat for non-human biodiversity. Chris.
Thanks. I can answer one question really, really quickly in relation to when is a weed tree species safe. And it's got oaks are approved under this rule. Oaks aren't weed species in our community or in our council, and I actively say no to the removal of some weed tree species because they're not a particular threat unless they're in a biodiversity area, and so there's no real kind of rule there. There's no exemptions in Boroondara. And the last question is from one of our councillors, so I should probably read this one out, but I'm going to show my ignorance here because I don't know the answer. How is council approaching the replacement of ageing street trees, and roughly what percentage of ageing street trees need to be replaced in the next 30 years? Look, I can certainly tell you the first part of that is that it's a strategic kind of replacement program. Certainly I know that the canopy cover assessment is really going to help and assist in that, trying to identify areas that are vulnerable or are underperforming. But yeah, the idea is to kind of, you know, strategically remove some of that ageing population, you know, over time.
Well, thank you, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to all questions, but I think we've got to lots of them. And I think from Chris's last slide, we all know where we can go to take questions further.